bring the education into it. And we started to think about what sort of research we wanted to do, taking some of the MOOC research that we'd been doing forward into the future. So I don't know how many of you were at LAK last year at Edinburgh, but there was this kind of strange scheduling thing where there was 15 minutes between when the sessions finished and when they opened the cafeteria for lunch. And in that time, these huge queues formed of people really hungry, ready to have their lunch. And of course, Aneesha and I were standing in one of these queues on one of the days of LAK, just, bouncing a few ideas off each other, and we came up with the idea for this paper. So I think that says something about the wonderful nature of LAK and bringing people together and giving them an opportunity to talk and discuss, and even if you constrain them by putting them in a really long line and not feeding them. But but one of the things that Aneesha was saying, so Aneesha works for the University of Queensland and she works in their MOOC team developing MOOCs. She loves MOOCs, she likes developing them, she likes doing them. I don't know anyone else who's done as many MOOCs as Aneesha. And she said, well, when I need help in a MOOC, the first thing I do is I go to the discussion forum and I do a search. So she said, wouldn't it be interesting if we went in and we had a look at the kinds of searches that students are doing in order to identify which areas within the MOOC that they need help. So we went and got the ethics, and we got 4 MOOCs from the University of Melbourne, which is where Paula and I are based. And we did a search through to find out the searches, how many searches there were, and the kinds of terms that they were looking at. And we found that there were very few. And there really wasn't enough to be able to do any kind of statistically significant study. And which in itself I thought was an interesting finding. So the students are not using search as much as perhaps we thought they are. Now some of that may be down to the platform. We use Coursera and the search tool in there. I'll let you make your own mind up about that. But yeah, so that was where we started. And then we thought, well, wouldn't it be more interesting, because Paula came in at that point as the educational psychologist, and she's a bit of an expert in self-regulated learning. And she said, well, let's take this help seeking a little bit further and let's broaden it out to some of the things that students might do in a MOOC to get help that is beyond just searching in a discussion forum. So we thought, well, where can they seek help from? They can seek help from the teachers, but these are massive courses, so the teacher isn't giving that one-to-one help that you would see elsewhere. They could seek help from their peers, which they could do through something like the discussion forum or through face-to-face groups, which we hear happen in MOOCs, apparently. They could go to the resources, either internal or external to the MOOC, and perhaps several other ways that they seek help that we may or may not know about. So at that point we thought, right, we want to do a study on this, but it's going to be very exploratory. So we just really take the data, we'd look at what we had and see what we could find from that. And we also submitted this to this conference as a work in progress. So we're viewing this as very much the first step. Sort of what Kirsty was saying there at the end. We want to kind of put the idea out there to see if it has legs. And then if it does, then we'd like to perhaps move it forward. So, so we came up with 2 different research questions to drive the study. So we wanted to look at whether or not we could develop some learner profiles for help-seeking behaviours in MOOC environments. And one of the other things that all 3 of us are very much involved in is the idea of learning design. And so we wanted to bring in the idea of, well, what impact does learning design have on the different help-seeking behaviours that we see in MOOCs? Because often MOOC studies just look at a single MOOC with a single design. There are very few MOOC studies. We're seeing more emerging now, but there are a few MOOC studies that go across multiple MOOCs to see what those differences in design might do to some of these behaviours. So the MOOCs that we looked at, there are 4 MOOCs. One is animal behaviour. Goes for 8 weeks. It's very much a week by week. You do this in week 1, you do this in week 2, so on and so forth. And we had a look at what the role of the discussion forum was within this. And in this one, there's sort of no thing that says you have to go and use the discussion forum, but the MOOC coordinator has a week-by-week discussion area that people can use in whatever way they'd like to. The next one is a MOOC called Assessment and Teaching of 21st Century Skills. It's a 6-week MOOC. Again, it's a sequential week-by-week one. And throughout all of the videos in the MOOC, there are prompts to go to the discussion board and to actually talk about particular topics as students go through. The third one is the French Revolution. It again goes for 6 weeks. Again, it's a sequential, and they have weekly discussion prompts. So at the beginning of each week, there's a question posted there by the teacher, and the students can respond to that particular question. And the fourth one is Discrete Optimization, a computer science MOOC. It's 8 weeks, but it's open. So the students can go in there, and from day 1, they get all the course material, all the assessments, and they can choose the order that they do it in. Okay, and this is explained to them very carefully at the beginning of the MOOC that really they can drive the learning, they can drive the sequence. So those were the 4 MOOCs that we chose, and one of the reasons that we chose these particular MOOCs is that 2 of them are very much kind of general interest MOOCs. So the French Revolution and animal behaviour, it's just for people who kind of have a bit of an interest in this area, want to learn a bit more at a very kind of basic level. Assessment and teaching of 21st century skills and discrete optimisation are a little bit more professional development MOOCs aimed at people who want to upskill in those particular areas. So we looked at all sorts of different behaviours that students can do in MOOCs, and we sort of tried to work out the ones that might have some kind of association with help seeking, which we put into these 5 categories of active forum participation, passive forum participation, things to do with assessment. We did look at the search, we did include that as a feature within the matrix. Video interaction, because we thought things like pausing and rewinding videos might be one way that students are revising material or going back because they're not quite getting it the first time. And other things were just general statistics around total click streams, grades, whether or not the student was part of the signature track in Coursera we thought might also be interesting, and whether they'd signed up for notifications as well. Now, as I said, Aneesha is our data scientist, and so she's great with all the data sciencey stuff. Paula's our educational psychologist, so she's really good at the numbers too, and I'm not. So I'm going to try and explain this method, but if I get it wrong, someone in the room please help me. So we took those 25 features and in the 5 categories of our feature matrix there, and we scaled them first using a min-max feature scaling. Then what we did is we applied a dimension reduction thing, which basically can, if I get this right, it takes something that's quite multidimensional, it takes it down into a smaller space, and we were able to then plot this in a 2-dimensional space, and I'll show you the scatter plots that we came up with there. But after we'd done that, we used the Affinity propagation algorithm. And when we were putting together this paper, the thing we were trying to say was sort of significant about the paper and that added to the field is that a lot of people use other kinds of algorithms to cluster, and not many people use this particular algorithm. But we like it because we don't have to specify the number of clusters. The algorithm works that out for us, which is really good. It puts the learners together in the clusters, but then it also gives like an exemplar. So a student that sort of most fits that profile or that cluster that we could then have a look at. And what we did is we took those exemplars and we assigned them to learner profiles. So there were lots of exemplars, and we tried to put together the exemplars that most matched together. How did I go? Did that make sense? Yeah? All right, so here's an example of one of the scatter plots. So this was for the French Revolution. And we can see that there are a number of clusters there, 16 or 17 of them, I believe. And so I've shown you this one a little bit bigger, not a great resolution, but anyway. And then we did one of these for each of the 4 MOOCs, so I don't expect you to be able to read that in any great detail. But once we got all the different clusters together, we created 5 learner profiles. So low engagement, assessment-focused low grade, passive engagement, active engagement, and assessment-focused high grade. Now, the interesting thing, the low engagement one, so these people are really not doing very much. Now, what I want to say, though, is we didn't use all persistent students in this sample. We only used students who had attained a final grade of 40% or more, because we wanted people who had been active within the assessments as part of the sample. So there's roughly sort of 600 to 800 students in each MOOC as part of the sample for this. So the low engagement people, they had a low grade, they weren't looking at very many things within the MOOC. They weren't really trying the assessments very much because most of them had assessments you could put in multiple times, and there was no forum discussion activity at all. Interestingly, the highest percentage were from the French Revolution MOOC in this one, which we thought might be down to the fact that it is very much a general interest thing. So there probably wasn't the same motivation with some of these students. They probably weren't going for the signature track, and they were happy to just do enough to get through, and that was fine. The assessment-focused low grade was one that we just did not expect. So these are people who kept going back and trying the assignments over and over and over again, but they weren't getting any better. They were still performing quite low, which was quite surprising, and we're not quite sure how to explain this, so we'll talk about that in the future work. But one of the interesting things here was there were none of those in discrete optimisation. And one of the reasons we think that is, coming back to the learning design behind this, is that discrete optimisation had assessments that were automatically marked, and there was a very complicated but good feedback structure for students. So we're thinking that if these students in discrete optimization were trying things multiple times, the feedback that they were getting was obviously good enough that they were improving and they didn't end up falling into this group. So that tells us something about the feedback structures that we need for MOOCs in terms of helping students, especially if they are making multiple attempts within assessments. Passive engagement, not surprising, most students fit into a profile that looks like this across all the MOOCs, okay. Medium grade, moderate page views, not that active in the forums, but you know, a lot of these students have done enough to get through, and that's fine. And again, discrete optimization, 67% of the students fell into this. So 2/3 of the students doing this particular course fell into passive engagement, which was interesting. Active engagement. So these were people with high grades, moderate assessment attempts, very high page views. So we see these people as the ones that were really there, getting involved. They were really, there was a high level of participation in the forums. So these are the kinds of MOOC students you really want, I guess, in your MOOC. And in this one, discrete optimization was up there. And again, we think we're looking at whether or not the very well put together but open structure of the learning design perhaps helps to explain some of this MOOC. And this is a MOOC that they have done a lot of reworking on. Every time they deliver this MOOC, they've redeveloped it, they've improved the videos, they've improved the feedback structures. It's quite an interesting MOOC. And the top one is the assessment-focused high grades. Now, these are people who got high grades. They did have high assessment attempts, but they virtually looked at nothing else in the MOOC. They didn't really go to the pages, they didn't really watch the videos, and they had no sort of forum activity to speak of, okay? So, and in this case, we're thinking these are probably the people with a very high level of prior knowledge. So they came in, they already knew the area, and they just went in and did the assessments to be able to get through the course. But it was interesting that there were none of these profiles seemed to be present in the French Revolution and the discrete optimization. Now, one of those is general interest and one of those is a professional development MOOC. So these are the sorts of things that we're still trying to get our heads around in terms of what might indicate this, what might influence this. But what we're hoping is that some of what we're seeing here will help us to be able to work out, okay, if we're seeing these sorts of patterns, what kinds of support can we give for help-seeking behaviours in this case? So, moving on to this, and I did tell you I'd probably stick under time. What next? So this was just, as I said, the first pass at this. This is something that we wanted to do just to see what we could find, very exploratory. And what we want to do now is look at it in more detail with the design factors. So we've sort of looked at things like the integration of discussion forums, but we want to go into a little bit more detail about how the videos work together with activities, what the role of peer assessment is, all of those sorts of things as well, because some of those had peer assessment activities. So we want to basically go further into detail with the learning design. The other thing we want to do is start to use some sequential and temporal analysis of the learner exemplars. So for each of the different cluster groups, we want to go and look at, well, what were the sequences that we see in those particular cluster groups? Were they sticking to the design, or were they doing things in their own way? Which will be interesting to also look at the difference between the 3 sequential MOOCs and the 1 open MOOC and see what we might see there in different patterns. In our first LAK paper about 4 years ago, we did find that the students who did sort of skip around, went back and forth, we did a kind of sequential analysis there, did better in the MOOC overall. But I don't know how you translate that into advice for students. You know, skip around a lot, you'll do better. So we want to also think about the learner demographics. So that wasn't in our feature matrix here. So we want to pull in some of the things around gender, age, prior knowledge, all the different things that we might be able to get from the surveys that we run within Coursera. And of course, all of this is what we want to put towards some more targeted support and feedback strategies for students. And that's hopefully going to be the outcome of the rest of this work and the work that we've already done here. So that's all I have to talk about today, and I will ask for questions, but just before I do, I just want to say, if your questions are about data mining techniques, here's Aneesha's email.
And you just brought us back to our original time schedule.
There you go.
So there you go. So we actually have a lot of time for questions.
Oh,
go right ahead.
Have you considered the idea that the assessment focus profile might be people that are cheating? I've read a paper based on edX data where students that basically did nothing in the course and did lots of assessments were basically using multiple profiles to figure out the answers to the question.
That's quite possible. One of the things, and sorry to anyone who's heard me talk about the discrete optimization MOOC before, because I have told this story at a previous LAK, but we did this in the 2015 cohorts. Had we done this in the 2013 cohorts, we had a student who gamed the assessment system in discrete optimization. So discrete optimization, for those of you that don't know, it's a computer science MOOC and it's all about solving problems. So the problem of getting a good mark in the assessment, he solved by writing a script that would put his code into the feedback system, and if it got it back and it was less than 100%, it would change one thing in the code and resubmit it. So he submitted his assignment 4,000 times. He got 100%. Well, I think that was a great example of discrete optimization, I thought, but you know. But if we'd had that data set, that would have really skewed some of these clusters, I think. So I think you're right. I think it's something that we need to think about in terms of the honesty of students and those that are gaming the system in that way. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Can you say something about the range of different assessment methods that were used in the MOOC? Because
Yes.
It strikes me that's another possible variable.
Well, that's right. Each of the MOOCs had different types of multiple choice assessments, but some of those multiple choice were used in a formative way and some were summative. As I said, the discrete optimization has 7 programming assignments that basically the students have to submit code and they're automatically marked in that way. The 21st Century Skills MOOC is very much based around quizzes and peer assessment. And I'm just trying to think what the other ones are. I think French Revolution is peer assessment as well, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
I was trying to imagine, Marat was killed in, Bath Sword.
Yeah, exactly. Probably not great for that.
So peer assessment.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that range affect the way that you interpret what you've seen at all?
Well, that's what we want to look into next. So we didn't really get to that point of going into much more than... So we were using sort of the discussion as our main focus in terms of the help seeking, and then the other things were things we just thought might be interesting. So I think our next step needs to be looking at assessment type in more detail, and also then looking at the way that the content is delivered in more detail. Because we're also very conscious that discussion forums may stop being a central help-seeking mechanism in MOOCs with the sort of move away from cohort-based MOOCs to an on-demand system. So if you're not necessarily studying at the same time as all of your peers, peer assessment and discussion forums are possibly not going to be as good a help-seeking mechanisms as they are currently in MOOCs. So something that we're thinking about in where we might take this in the future. Yeah.
Other questions? Phil?
Phil.
Please receive this as a potentially constructively critical question
Oh.
rather than a stick in the knife and turn it kind of question.
No, from you, Phil, you could stick in the knife, I don't mind.
I wonder if you might comment about, lots of people are doing these kinds of clusterings of
Yeah.
empirical data. And I wonder whether we're generating somewhat empirically derived learning styles rather than fantasy-derived learning styles that have been popular in education.
Yeah.
And what sense you might have about ways in which, since they actually are partly based on behavior as well as other static factors,
Yeah.
they might be a window onto making suggestions about how learners would change the behaviors that might lead them to the case where they need to be seeking help.
Mm.
In other words, is
Yeah.
it possible that these newish learning styles, if I can call them that,
Yeah.
might actually point toward where you would want to intervene, not as in saying seek fewer assessments or whatever, but
Yeah.
change the way you study.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because we've come to this research very much in the sense of how do we help teachers to work out their design more so. So if we can design to do some of what you're saying there in terms of being able to redirect students as necessary. I'm not a fan of predictive analytics, I'll be completely honest, so I don't want to be using this information to sort of try and tap people on the shoulders in a predictive manner, if that makes sense. So, but if we can build stuff into the design that helps them, as you say, be able to identify when they need help better. But we're seeing a lot of very strategic use through some of the profiles that are emerging, and I wonder, even if we do make some interventions, how effective they're going to be if the students have come in with such a defined strategy and motivation into some of these environments. But yeah, it's a good point. Very good point.
One last question.
I was just wondering if you had any view on how much these sort of patterns were tied to platform and the university, so you have
Yeah.
a decent effort and control for sort of the topic and the length of the course and these kinds of things. But you said they were all Coursera courses, I think?
They are.
And I assume all from Melbourne, yeah?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
So, and I mean, I appreciate data access is tricky, but
Yeah.
if you have any view on, the platforms or other.
I think that's really important. I've been talking to some colleagues at another institution in Australia that shall remain unnamed, who are on a different platform, and begging them for us to do some cross studies because they're on FutureLearn. And for example, the discussion-based idea of where the discussion sits within FutureLearn is different to Coursera. Having a discussion that's right there and there, like next to a video that you're watching, could have an impact on the help-seeking behaviour or the interaction with the discussion than a Coursera MOOC where they've actually got to click onto another screen and then go and put their things in there. And the student who has a lower motivation is just not going to take that step. So, no, I think it's a really good point. And we want to do it. So if anyone in the room uses... so Aneesha actually is at the University of Queensland and uses edX. But even within a research group like this, the sharing of data is an issue. So, but if we can get around it with anyone else, we'd be happy to talk, definitely. Yeah, thanks.